and the sort of conventionally understood, predictable and modelable travel patterns.
Okay, Jonathan, your stab at it.
I echo what Tony has said. I think it's a period of uncertainty. There are numerous possible consequences, and some of them are sort of obvious, that what happens to the economy in the context of Brexit and wider indeed, because London, above all, if you like, within and its wider catchment, the London and South East territories, are very much linked inevitably, inextricably to the wider European situation. Are there losses in migrants into London from Europe who may have been using public transport more than locals? I mean, we don't see any references to that, and it may be too early to tell, but it's a possibility. If I were to take the analogy of a high street, who themselves are in some trouble, have anchor stores if they're going to be successful. You have Marks and Sparks or John Lewis or whatever. What we're seeing, certainly in the public transport context, is that there are anchor railway operations, in the broader sense, national rail operations, which are struggling. I mean, GTR is the most immediate and urgent one. That has hemorrhaged passengers. That can only be bad news for actually TfL and potentially London as a whole. People may go and do their shopping or spend other leisure time elsewhere, other ways. So there are things there which TfL may well themselves have been forecasting it'll be all right in 2018-19. Will it? I question that. I went through, actually, coming to here, a whole load of station usage statistics across the London and South East and indeed the eastern counties. For example, Southern, now part of GTR, and has been for several years, had huge losses in total volume, not just sort of systemic changes possibly in season ticket use versus full fare or contactless, during the period 2015-16, and they're still not back to full volumes, and that was related to strikes, and it was also related, you'll remember well, to London Bridge. So even within the internalised transport industry perspectives, I would say that there's no stable situation going ahead. One can rely to an extent on things like the Elizabeth line, subject to that being commissioned effectively and reliably, unlike the counterpart, then that no doubt will be good news, and I'm sure we all hope it will. But that does not guarantee that there is the stability there, even for TfL's own forecasting processes and priorities, to guarantee, I would say, a 2021 safe home.
So would it be fair to say then you're sceptical
Yes.
to TfL's optimism? Okay. Richard?
Just to give some context of where I'm coming from, we work with over 100 transport operators worldwide, including TfL's peers in New York, Hong Kong, Canada, in Montreal, Toronto, Paris, and so on. And it's quite interesting, I think, to look at the international trends, because what I think, obviously, a lot of people are worried about whether there's something societal going on. Are people spending more time at home rather than going out? Are they going to work fewer days of the week and so on? And actually what we see is that although in the UK and particularly the US we're seeing significant declines for public transport, actually for different reasons, I believe, for comparable countries we're still seeing strong growth. So for metros, for example, and railways in Iberia, we're looking at +4%, +8% growth in passenger demand for the last year. In Australia, 6%, and Germany just 2%, but Canada between 4 and 12% for systems that haven't actually grown. So these countries are seeing exceptionally strong growth in the demand for public transport, but they are similar cultures. So a lot of these social trends, if they're happening here, and I'm sure they are to some degree, ought to be manifesting themselves in those other countries. So my belief, although there's no proof yet, I don't think anyone's got any proof, is that it's still very much about the economy. And I think it's still, and the research that we've done has also looked at, the responsiveness of fares to incomes, for example, and we know there's a response globally of transport demand for public transport with respect to incomes. But is there an even greater response in London with respect to disposable incomes, with rents rising, particularly amongst the young? So disposable incomes have been particularly squeezed in recent years. So my sort of hunch is it's still 80% about the economy. And of course, whether or not TfL meets that 1 billion deficit will be very much driven by those economic factors. In terms of whether TfL can continue to increase efficiencies over the next period to 21-22, it's notable that the improvement in cost efficiency of the tube in particular has been one of the most significant turnarounds that we've seen internationally, apart from the odd sort of operator in Iberia after the 2008-2009 crash. So that probably gives some confidence that there's, a lot has been done and therefore could potentially be continued to do to achieve a strong profile of cost efficiency growth. But I think in terms of modelling, forecasts are forecasts. You hear often, and models are, I think, probably always wrong. The point is about models is that they reduce the risk of uncertainty, that we can sort of narrow the band of confidence, or that where the eventual revenue may fall.
Matt, your opening comment.
Thank you. It probably makes sense for me to give some context as well. So advertising, TfL being an important media owner within the out-of-home landscape. So if I start with the UK advertising market, we're seeing steady growth, 4.6% growth in 2017, and that was the 8th consecutive year of market growth. But we then break those figures down into the different media channels, so TV, radio, print, out-of-home. Out-of-home being where TfL sits, it was 1.5% last year, so not so fast, and we're projecting growth around 1.5% again for the coming year. We don't have the separate figures for London, and specifically for TfL, but around 45% of the 1.1 billion a year is in the London and South East region, of which TfL obviously is a significant partner with that. I think, so any optimism in terms of increasing growth from the advertising revenue, we need to be very cautious on that. It's also important to bear in mind that none of the out-of-home media owners in the UK operate at 100% inventory. They've all got spare capacity. So you've got intense competition within the out-of-home media sector against each other, but you've then got intense competition for out-of-home versus other areas, so online, TV, radio. So it's, I think, short answer, it's a relatively flat sort of income coming through, and that's before you start to take account different headwinds. One of the headwinds obviously being the uncertainty around Brexit, but another headwind which I think it'd be worth spending some time on is the proposed HFSS advertising restrictions for TfL, because I think we need to look at that in the context as well. HFSS is high fat, sugar and salt, so probably more popularly known as junk food ad ban.
Right, sorry. Thank you.
Are you suggesting that that is going to severely limit their commercial earnings?
So we estimate that around 10 to 15% of the advertising revenue will be impacted by a HFSS advertising ban. So if you look at that over a 5-year contract period, which is normally the way that you look at out-of-home media owners, that's around £75 million a year, so 375 million over a 5-year period.
That's TfL, or that's...
That's the London area.
Right.
It's worth digging into because we don't have sight of the TfL specific figures within that, but we can point to it being a significant media owner, obviously owning many of the out-of-home assets that are so valuable within Zone 1 and 2. And that isn't a revenue stream, the HFSS revenue stream, 2 factors to consider within that. One is the new nutrient profiling model, which will come in 12 months' time, and that will mean that even more products could potentially be restricted. And Sorry, I lost my thread for a second. It's whether on the sorry, I've lost my thread on the second point. I'll come back to it. But the nutrient profiling model is a very important factor to really take into account. And sorry, the second point was that the assets that it affects, where you advertise HFSS products, are in impulse purchase points. So they're at bus shelters. They say, go in here. So you won't find an easy replacement for that impulse purchasing from brand advertising. So the assumption that that money is going to come in and replace is one that really does need to be challenged.
So just to be clear then, the HFSS that you've just described, is that coming from government or is that a TfL decision?
So that's within the London Food Plan.
Which is the Mayor's London Food Plan?
The Mayor's London Food Plan, and it specifically focuses in on TfL.
Okay. So it's a decision the Mayor has made for moral reasons or whatever else that could have a detrimental impact on commercial revenue streams for TfL? Okay.
But the point I would add as well is it wouldn't necessarily just be for TfL. I think it's something that has implications for the other out-of-home media owners within London as well.
Okay.
So indirectly, it has an impact.
Okay. That's quite fine, actually. I don't think we were aware of that. And I think that one of the things that we do at the end of these meetings is we tend to write to our guests, not just to thank you for coming, but to pick up any other points. And I think we may be interested in hearing more about that. If that's okay. We're going to look at, we can't do this investigation without looking at fares, both the fares as they are now and fares going off into the future. So focusing on fares as they are now is going to be Assemblymember Cooper.
Although, just on that final point, presumably if manufacturers of products that contain high quantities of one of those items, for example, other drinks are available, but Ribena style products who have already started adjusting the level of sugar in response to government changes, presumably they would then be able to continue to advertise because it would no longer be a high sugar product. Because that's what they're doing, aren't they?
They will be, yes.
Yeah. Have you modelled that into your loss that you're talking
the
about?
lag, what you need to model in is the lag between a ban coming into effect and the manufacturing time.
No, the manufacturers have already responded to the forthcoming ban by changing the level of sugar in their products. They've already done it now, even before the restrictions.
Some, I agree.
There are some.
I agree, but not all.
So
and
have you modelled that into?
Yes, that is.
So you're still saying that this is the level of loss, 10 to 15%, despite the fact that some manufacturers have already responded to government changes.
That's what.
So potentially, once the London Food Plan comes in, other manufacturers might change as well. But you think there would then be a lag? Okay.
There would be a lag.
Thank you. I'm sure we will explore that more, but I just wanted to see if you'd model that into your assumptions. So we've seen that, I just wonder if I could come back to Jonathan now. We've had this problem which we explored at the last meeting where, modelling may always be inaccurate, I don't know, but in this case, TfL's modelling has always been inaccurate in the upwards direction, and they've been forced to remodel their expected fare income down 4 times in a row. Do you think that the Mayor's fares freeze has done anything in terms of maintaining demand? Because obviously you were just talking about the wider context and dropping demand across a number of other areas. Has it helped with keeping demand up at all?
It's hard to tell for the simple reason that the fare is only part of the equation which passengers and more widely London experiences. At the same time, we have had the hopper fare come on, for example. So you can't just say it's one thing. There's actually various things happening simultaneously. Equally, the quality of services can be as much, if not more important than actual fares levels, because it's the total, I think I remember saying this about a year or two ago at a similar event here, it's the total generalised cost, if you like, the amount you pay, whether directly or through a season or some sort of longer term charge, plus the experience of the travel. And there, I think it's fair to say that the quality is variable. On the buses, there are still concerns about the speed of buses, which could be a far bigger determinant of passenger volume and willingness to get on a bus than the actual fare level. On the underground, you could argue about crowding. I mean, TfL have been quite open and said that they currently about 40% of passenger kilometres on the tube are in conditions of 4 passengers standing per square metre. That's explicit in the TfL's own report. And they're saying, unless we do something about it, actually that's going to get worse, up towards 55%. So there is TfL being totally aware that there's a number of equations affecting things. But to come back specifically on fares, since you asked that, the Mayor's fares freeze has been not one in relation to RPI. On National Rail, of course, it tends to go up with RPI plus. So that already leads to some discontinuities, which may or may not matter, to be honest. But it certainly means that the fares are actually going down in real terms. Now that has a real impact back to, if you like, to Gareth Bacon's first question. How can you be sure that your forward fares in real terms will actually have the value that you need in yield to afford all the investment you need, which is 3.3 billion a year on over 2 decades is what TfL are saying. So I am concerned that somewhere along the way there probably needs, and this is arguably a mayoral direction rather than anything else, because TfL has to respond to the mayor's instructions. There needs to be some understanding and some assessment of whether a change in the nature of any fares freeze could be considered. Should it be an RPI freeze, for example? Where is the value, or a London RPI freeze? I mean, who knows? At least those are options. At the moment, it's a very simple black or white process. And I do believe that there may need to be some subtlety going forwards if actually, because of the uncertainties, it would be wise for City Hall as a whole to say, well, actually, we need a more stable situation going forwards for TfL for the wider good of London.
I'd like to ask Tony, do you think the Mayor can afford a second term fare freeze?
I think it would be it's a decision that would require a great deal of thought, let's put it that way. I think that all of this slightly depends on if TfL's ridership were to return to reasonable levels of volume growth, then that would suggest, I think, that there's enough, that the elasticities are such that you could put the fares up ahead of inflation, or at least in line with earnings, say, as has been the policy in the past. If we were in a world where ridership was beginning to decline for some reasons that we don't fully yet understand, then of course the reverse I think would be true. I mean, in the sense if you then put up fares, you'd start to push people off the system, and so in a sense there's a relationship between whether we think the long-term trend is upwards or downwards in terms of total number of people travelling, as to whether there is the elasticity in the system, or the lack of it, in order to encourage putting up fares above inflation, or to discourage you from doing that. You don't want to end up chasing instead of putting up fares and chasing the numbers down, as happened in public transport in the 50s and 60s. So if we assume that in the end the population of the city is still growing, although the projections produced by ONS recently are for a less big increase in population running ahead. We've got the first year that's kicked in, partly because of a decline in migration. So if that were to change, and if there were to be, and there hasn't been so far, any suggestion that employment numbers were going to level off or fall, and in fact they've increased pretty well, I think every month, in fact, since choose a month at random, June 2016. So if population continues to grow and employment continues to grow, unless there's some radical change in the way we all travel, then it ought to be possible to put up fares and not drive people off the system. But as I say, the two things are linked. But as I say, I think continuing a fare freeze very long, given the numbers we've seen in recent years, would be a brave decision.
Brave decision, Minister. I think that's where that comes from. Do you think, Tony, that the fares are at the right level? It might be a slightly impossible question.
Well, no, it's not. I mean, in the sense, you know, here we are in London, in the United Kingdom, and we have a particular model for doing these things, the way we share the costs of using railways and using a number of services, actually. It's not unique to railways. We share them in a particular way, which in the UK has tended to mean passengers paying more. I think Richard will know more about this than me, and in other countries, passengers paying significantly less towards the overall cost of running, be it the national rail system or London's rail system. So, in a sense, dare I say it, fair to who? Fair to the fare payer, fair to the taxpayer, fair to some tax, you know, people in outer London who have to travel further. So all of these things. So I don't, you know, the word fare is a complicated one, as you've kindly implied. So I think that in the end, London has a fairly developed, it has, by European standards, one of the most developed transport systems in the world. And you'll have heard, you know, radio discussions, been programs on Radio 4 and recently about, you know, the remarkable nature of London's transport compared with everywhere else in the United Kingdom. And against that backdrop, and it is an amazing system by international standards, I think expecting passengers to pay a reasonable amount towards it is almost inevitably, politically, not going to change. If I can answer the question in a slightly different way.
I'd like to bring in the others as well for their thoughts about are fares at the right level. Thank you for that, Tony. That was really interesting. I'd like to start with Richard, actually, because Tony made a reference to international comparators, and you were doing some of those earlier.
So it's a fact that TfL fares are, for the tube and the DLR, amongst the highest in the world. For buses, they're pretty moderate, and I think that's a very important point, is that many other cities around the world have the same fare for bus and metro. And there's been a deliberate policy in London to have a difference in fare between those two modes, partly to allow low-income groups to move around without with a lower impact on their spending. Now, tube fares until sort of 2008, of course, did rise in line with incomes, with affordability, if you like. And the big sort of problem politically had been that after 2008, actually incomes fell in real terms, and yet fares continue to rise at or above the rate of inflation. So now you have fares frozen, and that means that fares are now pegged, if you like, in a way, to affordability, because real incomes haven't really been growing until recently. But I think it is a choice. You know, although we have some of the highest, even relative to prices of other goods in cities, amongst the highest fares in the world, we have structural factors against the tube ability to cover its costs. It is two systems. It has its nice sort of central area network in zones 1 and 2 and 3, but then it has a kind of like low density, you know, suburban network all the way around it. And that reduces the amount of demand that you get on the tube overall relative to other systems worldwide. And so that costs more money relative to, say, the Paris Metro, for example. And of course, in the UK, we've moved, for the tube at least, towards more of a sort of user pays principle with the cut of the government grant. At the same time, we're asking the tube to maintain its position. Sorry for talking about the tube so much, but it's where most of the revenue comes from, as a high-quality public transport system. And there is no doubt that relative to other systems in Europe and North America, after 20 years of investment, the tube is one of the most reliable metros in Europe and North America, and has very high-quality ambience and you know, standards of cleanliness and all those sort of things. So it is a choice. And of course, if we want fares to fall further in real terms, then difficult decisions would have to be made about the trade-offs between quality. And also, it's worth saying that, as Jonathan pointed out, you know, we see that there is, the international experience is that there is a high elasticity of demand with respect to service quality and density. So the more frequent trains you run, people just come into the system. It's like flow-through pipes almost. You increase the size of the pipe and more water flows through it. And in the central area, at least, that's probably the case. And yet the elasticity of demand with respect to fares is much lower. So internationally, on average, you increase demand by fares by 10% or reduce fares by 10%. You see, say, a 3 to 4% shift in demand. Whereas for supply, if you increase capacity or density by 10%, then you're seeing a 5 to 6% change in demand. So it's much more responsive to quality than price. So the question is, do we want to have the money available to continue to reinvest in the tube, either through fares but also from central or London government income, in order to maintain the supply, maintain the investment programme, increase frequencies and therefore increase demand?
You almost seem to be saying that it matters less what level the fares are set at, but it's more to do with the quality of the experience that people have and the sheer number of trains that are available.
International experience is that demand is much more responsive to quality of service and service
frequency.
intensity. Yes.
So if we could run more tubes, more tube trains, then and they were all very high quality, then would it actually matter what level we set the fares at all?
Well, I think that's slightly independent because we still need to have the revenue to pay for that investment.
Yes, for the rolling stock, sure.
So
maintaining the system.
Yes, and the danger is, and as we've seen in other countries worldwide, is that if the fares are continue to reduce in real terms, then choices have to be made about things like service levels. Although the experience actually has been, in Iberia in particular, that they feel in some cities, major cities in the Iberia Peninsula, that they, after 2008, they cut more service than they should have done. So actually it was revenue negative, or sort of revenue cost negative to cut service. They feel that they shouldn't have cut the services to the extent that they should have done. But the political imperative starts to get pushed upon the operator to do things like cut service, even if it perhaps from a revenue cost perspective it's not beneficial.
Questions to you, Jonathan. Are the fares at the right level, whatever right you perceive right to be, and does it really matter what level we set them at all?
I think it matters particularly for the users. Frankly, that's what counts, and it's the pound in your pocket, as it were. What is important going forwards, and I think we both touched on it, is the quality. That's both measured in terms, I believe, of capacity and in how people perceive facilities, trains, stations, the well-being of the journey. A very recent example which I analysed, TfL takeover of the West Anglia inner lines out to Enfield and to Chingford, Walthamstow, Chingford. If you compare comparable stations alongside on, unfortunately, GTR, but never mind, it was prior to the latest problems, and you take from 14-15, when the start of the new Office of Road and Rail Data started to be available, through to 16-17, which is the last directly comparable data. Those GTR stations, in equivalent basis, miles from London and so on zones, only grew by of the order of 20%. They still grew. Whereas the demand at TfL West Anglia stations grew by 45% for virtually the same service, apart from a slight change in the Sunday stoppers. Now, that tells you quite a lot about people's responsiveness to the offer with the right offer. It might also lead across to questions about shouldn't TfL be running some other services, stimulating, actually, bluntly, further revenue, further quality, further benefits for those areas. I shall be very interested soon to be able to see what the 17-18 data is for stations, for example, in southeastern and in southern, compared to what might have been the case had you seen a takeover of those services by TfL, as was a possibility under the previous mayor. Until there was a disagreement between the mayor and the minister.
Chris Grayling fan club along with the rest of us.
But the reality is that could mean a real difference in revenues as well as quality and in all-round benefits. Now, those are possibilities. If you like, it hints also at the extent to which you might, in commercial marketing terms, consider demand to be mature, i.e. very hard to shift it further onwards and get more bottom line, however you judge that, or immature, with the opportunity for lots more sales and wider outcomes. Crossrail, in that sense, Elizabeth's line, represents immaturity.
I think we're probably going.
But you're probably going to go on to that.
I think
point,
we're going slightly beyond my
Yes.
sort of more immediate questions. I
Yes.
think here, although obviously that's very interesting. I'm sure we'll come back to some of those comments. I don't know whether you want to add anything, Matt, to the fares at the right level, and does it even matter at what level we set them?
I think the consideration from the advertising perspective is ultimately it's the size of your audience. It's the volume of eyeballs that you sell, and your inventory is sold on that basis. So lower passenger numbers means less income.
Yeah, it's very simple. Do you want to add anything to that, Tony? Because I didn't really ask you does it even matter what level we set them at?
I mean, as Jonathan said, it clearly matters to passengers, to people who use the system, and it matters to some more than others for obvious reasons, and if you travel further and so on. So I suppose the other thing to say, though, for the avoidance of doubt, is that TfL, the mayor's control of the fares and the yield is an amazing freedom for the mayor. Having control over £5 billion worth of fares, compared with the other city regions and city regional mayors, and indeed the rest of local government, is an incredible benefit in terms of the liberation that gives the mayor, City Hall, to control its own destiny. Now, there's an argument about, come sure onto government grants and business rates and all of that. But the truth is that giving the mayor the control over fares and to set the fares is a remarkable piece of devolution which gives the mayor greater autonomy and therefore greater accountability than would have been the case if, as in the other city regions, all the fares were either in the hands of the bus operators on the one hand or rail companies on the other. Much less control there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joe.
Thank you very much. Right, the second half of that question around fares really is about the longer term fares, and Assemblymember Eshelani is going to lead on that.
Football gets everywhere.
Thank you, Chair. And just continuing on fares, you all touched on some of the things that I wanted to explore, but if we look at a more longer term vision of fares and the change in practice which may reduce the fares coming in, so TfL's ambition is to increase walking and cycling with a figure of 45% increase in cycling by 2021-22 and an increase of journeys made on foot by 5% in the same period. I think of people like my sister who's just changed from working full-time to 3 days a week, so more flexible working, so a lot more people we're losing. There isn't any actual concrete data, but TfL estimate that workplace commuting has fallen by about 10% since 2006. And as more local government and even private sector organisations look at efficiency savings, you will see more of their employees working from home. And then one of my pastimes, shopping. We're seeing more of a move of people, again, looking at online shopping and deliveries. We covered that in our report on the Transport Committee in terms of what impact delivery was having on congestion in London, and more people are ordering online. So the whole shopping experience of a day trip with a family, all of you spending a day buying a day travel card, that would have been fair revenue. So to all of you really, what should TfL's strategy be looking at fare revenues over the next 10 years, so a more longer term vision on fares?
Go for it, Gil. Put it up as Mark Sally. It's what you also then can replace those previous and currently normative travel desires with. Certainly there is, over time, and TfL have done some sort of trend forecasting, but it's not in that particular area, at least explicitly so. The nature of what people do with their time, there's people that live longer, there's more time to be active in general, so that is potentially an up. There is the nature of what people are encouraged to do, other than, if you like, shopping per se. Go out and go to the cinema, go to events, you name it. And London, I think, has got and is getting even better at that sort of more all-round nature of human activity in terms of the London offer, which can only be good in terms of public transport demand. To the extent, however, that you have in the London 2050 infrastructure plan an increasing trend still towards high-density clustering of jobs, more dissociated from housing locations. That requires more travel, but it's more travel in the expensive to resource peak time, which in turn means that unless you're careful, you end up with a greater spread between peak volume and off-peak volumes. So that's not necessarily helpful in terms of maintaining your revenue balance and getting revenues in. It, in the end, is going to require far more, I think, lateral thinking about forecasting and expectations, and a lot of, I think, of what Richard may be able to bring to bear in terms of the experience with other countries and the nature of things. It isn't that now that you can guarantee that you've got a season ticket and you do 5 days a week. I don't do that, and many others don't as well. Increasingly, Thursday is the new Friday, for example. And people have to be much more alert and responsive, I believe, to the nature of people's willingness to actually have a much more varied lifestyle.
Okay. Tony?
So,
Well, I mean, you know, clearly, a number of ways of travelling are to varying degrees excuse me, in competition with each other. And so, in a sense, if the, to use a rather exotic example, a rather exaggerated example, if the mayor was massively successful in convincing everybody to travel by bike and on foot, it's hard to believe it wouldn't abstract revenue from the fare box. I mean, it's just inevitable. And if I, on a personal note, as I saw at least one of the members here assembled on Saturday as I whizzed past on a bicycle through central London, it's easy to induce, for people who are not making very long journeys, easy to induce change. The interrelationship between congestion and road speeds and buses and cycling is clearly an interesting one. Within any, you can't cycle from, some people do actually, but generally most people are not going to cycle from Richmond to Oxford Circus every day, but all the segments within that I think are potentially replaceable, and as the density of the city increases, then the opportunities to live and work nearer to live nearer to work are probably a bit more than they used to be. So, Canary Wharf is deliberately being expanded to allow, lots of residential near a massive new business district. So I'm not saying everybody who lives there will work there, but it at least offers that choice. So I do think that the interrelationship between different forms of transport in the city, and this is before you get to private hire vehicles and their regulation, where, in a sense, the TfL is both a regulator, it's a regulator of private hire, which is competing for the fare box. Complicated. So, all of these things interact, and they interact with the way the city is developing. So I think, in a sense, the modelling that underpins fare yield will have to pick up all of this and to learn that we're changing our lives, and that offices are not occupied 9 to 5 days a week. But having said that, there are new office models that are simply occupied by different people 24 hours a day.
Oh, yeah.
And they move in and out all the time.
Richard?
I mean, it's difficult because for TfL, their strategy for fares, their strategy for fares is to presumably fulfil what the mayor would like for fares. From a more political point of view, what ought to be the strategy for fares, I think, is in part driven by what affordability is doing. It's very important that fares for the tube and buses are, of course, affordable. And by fares actually increasing relative to wages, that has been a significant problem for people. And as I said, it's understandable perhaps why policies have been put forward for freezing fares. But if incomes do come back to increasing in real terms, then of course that gives more potential for fares to go back to being changed in line with inflation or inflation plus. The other strategies that might be worth thinking about, we know that the off-peak has been hit hardest by the changes in the economy. And of course the off-peak is going to be more responsive, more elastic to price, and yet the peak isn't. So one choice could be to have more differential between the peak and the off-peak, whilst keeping overall fares, if you like, on average the same. But the danger there is, and we did some research in Hong Kong that showed this, is that actually it's people on lower incomes that are less able to make the choice of travelling at a different time, earlier or later, than people on higher incomes. So it's potentially a regressive policy. But again, there needs to be that sort of decision as well between, you know, the sort of, well, do we want to maintain a very high quality public transport system? And that's also a decision that comes into the national realm as well, because some investment projects for the tube have extremely high benefit cost ratios, yet they might not be cost benefit neutral for TfL. Because of the very high wider economic benefits that investment in transport have, particularly in a city like London. Is the policy to just minimise subsidy to ensure that the government finances or local finance, city finances are okay? So it's a very wide decision about fares. It's very, I believe it's not just local. It's potentially even beyond the M25 region as well. And it's always worth remembering that although we've had a very, very big investment in the tube, that wouldn't have been possible had fares, it would have been much more difficult to have done had fares not gone up at RPI plus over the last 20 years since the mid-80s. And metros are capital investment projects that never end. And there will never be an end to the need to upgrades of lines. On average, metros around the world need operating costs plus 40% to keep going and have it. Well, that's how much they spend. That's probably should be higher. It should be operating costs plus 50, 60%. But there will always need to be money for capital reinvestment, either from central government or from fare income.
I just wanted to touch just on that as well, but if you could also look at, if we were looking at an increase in population and businesses, do you think that would help in terms of increasing fares and the revenue? You talked about customers and responding to what they want.
Yeah, I mean, I guess where I would come at this is, you know, any entrepreneurial media owner essentially looks at what the audience is doing and then looks at the ways in which to be able to target that audience. So if you see your audience moving into new areas, then you think about the ways in which you can generate commercial revenue from them in those areas. So we would be encouraging that thinking. So audience moving on cycle highways, what are the commercial opportunities around that from an advertising perspective? Audience moving into walking routes, what's the opportunities around that? So it's adapting and continuing to think almost as a kind of multi-channel media owner. So that's the long term, and I think that there are possibly even more, some would describe almost as drastic opportunities to commercialise. You know, I think if you're looking long term, explore all of the commercial opportunities within TfL. You know, naming rights for iconic locations, if done in the right way, with the right brands as partners, could create interesting new commercial revenue streams. It's not simply a case of putting a brand on top of a station, but doing that in very sensitive, if you like, almost. I mean, I think, you know, increasingly our our population are becoming more attuned to the connection between brands and iconic locations.
We can put a suggestion to the Mayor to run a trainer competition for new walking routes.
Well, certainly, I think that there are. I would come back to the sort of the conversation we're having around HFSS and the ways in which we as an industry can tackle the obesity problem. And I think that there are partnerships that the industry can work towards to do that. And that active lifestyle and promoting that more and more, I think, could be beneficial. And I think TfL could play a really critical role in that.
You all touched on it earlier in terms of the difficult challenge of sort of fare increase versus the service that people are actually paying for. And when I look at some of the emails that I've received from exasperated passengers, it's because they feel that they're not getting a service for which they're paying for. Do you think that Londoners would be willing to pay a bit more for better service?
I mean, I think that across the board, there's from time to time, research is undertaken to look at this precise question. And almost always people say they would be prepared to pay higher fares, rents, whatever it is,
When it comes to it.
to get a better service. But as your question rightly suggests, then there is the issue of, does the service really feel better? And by the way, and Richard alluded to this earlier, the tube clearly is better than it was 30, 40 years ago, 20 years ago in London. But the period to get there involved lots of spending and it not being better. And so there's a sort of lead time problem as well with investment. But I think to come back to your underlying question, I mean, put it its simplest, the Mayor of London needs to maximise the fare yield, however it's done. However, we can see at the national level, ministers struggling to try to convince people that perhaps they should pay, in the Prime Minister's words, a bit more tax to pay for services. So the question of whether ring-fenced fare revenues or ring-fenced taxes or whatever it is are the way forward to convince people, because they feel the money, we're probably going to come onto the road fund, aren't we, at some point, but that in a sense that their money is being used for the purpose they thought it was to be used, or that the fare increase is going to something they directly see. I think, although the Treasury has always been very unenthusiastic about so-called hypothecation, ring fencing, the truth is that the public is more convinced by it. And so I think there's always a trade-off for those setting tax levels and other ways of raising money from the public, how far they are prepared to try ring fencing bits of money or fare rate, taxes or fares, in order to convince the public it's worth having the money and spent on a particular service.
Anything to add to that?
Well, I suppose really the question is, would they be willing to pay? I guess as Tony says, if you ask people the question, they may say yes, and I totally agree with what Tony just said. I suppose the question from an economics point of view is, would there be would the revenue loss from higher fares, the demand loss from higher fares actually just negate the impact of the fare increase? The international experience globally is that most metros or most transport systems, bus systems, are natural monopolies, and therefore you can raise fares and raise income. But is it the right thing to do from an affordability point of view? Probably not. There has to be a limit to which you can do that, and that's why fares are regulated everywhere, globally, more or less, in major cities. Now, the elasticity of demand with respect to fare in London used to be quite low. It was, like 10 years ago, was about minus 0.2. That means that if you increase fares by 10%, you would expect a 2% reduction in patronage overall. But of course, lower incomes will be hit more than higher income people. Now, has that responsiveness changed in London? Because disposable incomes have been squeezed. And there's a question as to whether actually that elasticity or the responsiveness of demand with respect to price in London has actually gone up. and it's probably significantly gone up in the off-peak. So there are, relative to the peak. So it depends which time of day you're talking about as well, which income groups you're talking about, and clearly, you know, you can't just lump everybody into one box and say, you're all happy about it, aren't you? There's different groups of people will be severely, will find it very difficult, and others will not at all. And people at different times of the day will find it easy to deal with and not to deal with. So, but I think generally speaking, you know, mass transit systems are monopolies. They're natural monopolies, and therefore, yes, you can raise the price, but you probably wouldn't want to continuously.
I think there is a geographical issue with some of this. London is actively pressing forwards with opportunity areas, many of which are not, some of which are well located for schemes such as Crossrail, but not everywhere. The ones I'm familiar with, for example, along the Upper Lee Valley, struggle with a poor local service. And even the STAR scheme, which comes in theory next year, is not going to be at the frequency which all the stakeholders, including here the GLA, have desired. There is therefore needing to be, for many potentially for opportunity areas and intensification areas, I would argue, a linkage between the supply of public transport more generally, and the effectiveness of that investment going forwards. Now, how you capture that within the TfL budgeting process, it may not be exclusively TfL, but somewhere along the way that sort of linkage needs to be captured, because otherwise you may not have the quality of local bus services, or for that matter an improvement in local stations or rail services, which are both cause and consequence of the area's regeneration being effective. Now, maybe there's an advantage, if you like, in the monopoly supplier, as Richard's described, and because then at least you can encapsulate some of that and say, right, from who can afford to who needs, as it were. It's the classic redistribution process. But certainly that needs to happen. I would also wonder to what extent the bus services need to be reviewed in fares terms. That's a very dangerous subject to open up, because it's been sort of more or less a constant flat fare for quite a long while, been very successful in terms of speeding bus boarding, other benefits, becoming a flat fare. We now have a situation where it's, what's the analogy? The NHS. It's essential. It's far busier than the tube. We've got 2.2 billion passenger journeys a year on the buses. It was 2.3, it's dropped a bit. And it's essential, but how on earth do you fund what is a £500–600 million a year deficit? Now, that somewhere along the way, that is, it's as important to London as the NHS is nationally, and yet it causes huge revenue distribution issues. Those are choices, I think, where City Hall, in its broadest sense, yourselves and the Mayor and the officers, really need to consider how can we, as London as a whole, keep on affording that scale of public subsidy, internalised, essentially paid for by public transport users. We'll probably come on to this on the roads fund side as well, fairly soon. Because if you're going to do that and at the same time need the fares leverage, which we're all, I think, hinting at, in order to help fund, it won't be the totality, help fund major new capital investments, that there's only a certain amount that you can actually grasp simultaneously from the same sources of income, and then try and redistribute. I do have a genuine concern about how we go forward with buses in the long term.
Yeah. And I think that's something that we definitely put to the new Deputy Mayor for Transport in her confirmation hearing, in terms of the role that buses play, but equally mindful of the fact that in some areas there are just too many buses, and how do you redistribute that? But as you mentioned, big deficits with it across the bus network, and that's all from me, Chair.
Okay, a number of things that TfL are hanging their hat on going forward in terms of fixing the problem. One is forecasting demand, and they're forecasting it's going to go up every year. The Elizabeth line, I think it's fair to say they're betting the entire house on. And of course, commercial revenue. And the next section is going to be led by Assemblymember Pigeon on two of those subjects.
Lovely, thank you very much, Chair. Demand forecasting, we discussed it yesterday as well at Transport Committee. I understand there's some sort of international committee body that looks at demand forecasting and shares information. Network Rail mentioned yesterday. I'm just wondering, maybe start with you, Richard. Are the sort of declining trip rates we've seen, which do vary on modes, and some modes I think have increased, but many have declined, is this now a long-term trend, or is it just a blip at the moment because of the state of the economy? And what, maybe you can expand, you did a little bit earlier on some of the international comparisons.
Well, I would say that as I understand, commuting trip rates haven't declined that much. I think it's more to do with the trip rate. It's the off-peak, it's discretionary.
Leisure, yeah.
And I think, again, without wanting to repeat myself too much, I think that comes down to disposable incomes. But I haven't got the proof of that, but that's what I would expect.
Is this a long-term trend, though? Or is it just this blip at the moment because of the economy and uncertainty?
Well, it's of course, if disposable incomes are squeezed in real terms and stay squeezed, then it is a long-term trend. And if wages grow, if incomes grow, then of course that gets released. And I suppose the question is whether people's activities will revert. People will start going back to the centre of town more often as they're in the off-peak, as their real incomes grow, or whether they'll do something else. But again, I think, again, if we're talking about trip rates going down due to societal change, we all know that anecdotally we know more people that are working from home. We all know people that are working from home more. But whether that or not is actually, to what extent that is happening, I honestly don't know. But I'll just sort of caution back to what is happening elsewhere in the world, in developed economies similar to our own, is that public transport use is continuing to grow. Millennials are much more public transport, they've got much more acceptance of public transport. They're less likely to own a car, they're more likely to live in the centre of town. So all of these trends are very positive for public transport. I think it's very difficult to really know at this stage what's truly going on. In the United States, there's a big fall in public transport demand, but that's sort of a bit different in the sense that it's related also to actually growing incomes and falling gas prices and car ownership going up because incomes are going up. It's a totally different trend in the United States. So demand is falling there for reasons we don't know. Of course, the United States and the United Kingdom may be leading international trends in change for behaviour, how much we work at home or not. I mean, in terms of, to come back to modelling, our experience with the other public transport organisations globally is that they see that, the UK generally is being very competent at forecasting. We have quite a long profession in the United Kingdom, both in academia, in consulting and in transport authorities, for doing good transport planning and transport economics. We are, in the UK, one of the world leaders in this area. But models can be wrong. I mean, it's quite clear that they're often wrong, as we know, even in central government, with central government and the Treasury and so on, because they're trying to create a simplification of reality. And if that simplification is too simple, or the things are missing in the model, then the model is going to be wrong. But I would have, reasonable confidence that TfL is doing the best job that it can, certainly within its resources, to have the best, to have good modelling.
Yesterday, I'm trying to recall, it was Germany and Japan, I think Network Rail was saying, were actually really leading the way in some of this sort of forecast planning. And they were looking at that with interest with TfL and others to see whether they could learn from that. Is there any knowledge you have on that? I think France might have been in there as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I don't actually know much about the literature in Japan. of course, I mean, it's clearly good practice to look outside of the United Kingdom for anything, whether it's how to reduce costs on the tube or the bus system, or whether it's about best practices in demand modelling. I would strongly encourage anybody, including TfL, to look internationally at best practice, and also to seek out I think also, things that get papers and things that get research that gets published in countries like Japan might not often get picked up by the international community here, reading things in English. So it's an interesting point.
Tony, do you want to come in on this, and how, if this is a new trend, things are changing, how is this going to fundamentally change TfL's vision for public transport in London?
Richard knows more about this than I do. I'm a bit less optimistic than he is about the the necessary resumption in the growth trend. The reason for that, I'd say, is that, and you're right, I mean, the real incomes have been falling, I think you said, since 2008.
2008,
yeah. But fare incomes continued to rise after 2008 quite substantially. If you look at the fare incomes to TfL, they continued to rise, and they only fell in cash terms for the first time in 2017-18. Now, TfL is projecting, in effect, that the system will pick itself up and start all over again after this. Richard's got access to vastly more international data than me, but I would say I'm struck by, and at different circumstances I know, but New York City, which is an American city, obviously, but bus ridership has fallen fast in Manhattan. Subway ridership, the system has greater problems than the underground, has fallen as well. And there are one or two big metros here and there where the same kind of thing is visible. So I'm a bit more wary that there might have been some, in fairness to TfL, their modelling can't know this because none of us can know this, to be fair to them. If something had happened or is happening in very big cities, big old cities, or some subset of cities where smaller, newer cities with newer transport systems have got further to grow, for example. I mean, the other thing I'd add before it gets neglected is that, a lot of the assumptions about growth in fare income come from the Elizabeth line, Crossrail. And those in turn rely on the planning policies of the boroughs along the line. Now, TfL doesn't control the planning policies of the boroughs along the line. And I detect, it's a slightly wider issue than today, that there's some mood music change in the planning policies that somehow we've separately, nothing to do with fares, reached a point where some boroughs at least are more wary about development than they once were, and that the public mood has changed. So there are projections for massive increases in passenger numbers in central London. But I'm still not personally sure what people are going to do if there are not lots of new offices, lots of new shops actually retailing is going the other way. So I can see what the forecasts are, but I'm not 100% sure where people are going to go and what they're going to do when they get there. But, we'll find this out pretty soon. So, we'll find out in the next 2 years, because the forecasts for both passenger increases, some of which is abstracted from the national rail system, obviously, and for fare revenues are all published. We know what they are. We will find out soon whether the forecasting is correct.
To get into the Elizabeth line in more detail in a minute, could I just perhaps pick up Jonathan then, if Matt's got anything to add on the general thing about demand forecasting accuracy and whether this should change TfL's vision and calculations, I guess.
It's a moving feast. The process of having London as the Greater London area becoming more dense in population is underway, whether that's opportunity areas, whether it's a less obvious but nevertheless aggregating process around the existing sort of areas of London boroughs. The net effect is to have a higher density city, including outer London, over time. Whether everybody's comfortable with that is a point that's already been made, but it's in broad terms heading that way. And the net effect, therefore, is that it will cause, at whatever rate of travel people make, both for jobs and for other reasons, it will increase volume of demand for travel. Again, mode choices that we've considered. But somewhere along the way, public transport will have to pick up a lot of it because it can't all go by car, not least in outer London, saturation levels and the rest. The consequence has to be, therefore, that TfL, by whatever means it can, will have to serve more widely and maybe more intensively some of those flows. To the extent that they can be better served with less road pressures by using rail to public transport, and deliberately use that in a broad sense, as DLR and some trams and national rail as well as tube, then maybe that's better. And to, again, the extent to which people are relying in their cross-rail modelling, for example, on actually seeing a whole stream of developments out in West London, as sort of beads on a chain, which is Crossrail. We shall see how that comes to pass. But it certainly, it wouldn't work any other way. I mean, the 207 bus and the rest are not going to bear the strain if you try to cope with all the changes happening in the London Borough of Ealing and in Hillingdon and so on. So that has to happen, and density in that sense is a positive if you look at it in terms of demand for public transport. How best you can serve it is then a cost balance. There's also, I think, almost a jumbo jet analogy. It sounds slightly odd. We're not here talking of Heathrow per se. It's that an airline operator puts on a bigger plane. Actually, they've got to sell the seats. It ends up with a lower cost per seat mile is the crude sort of transport equation in the process. And therefore, they will sell the extra capacity. In a sense, my concern has been not that Crossrail per se, in that sense, what we'll come on to it, is not going to be successful, but how do you then maximise the use of all the other parts in the system? Back to buses, back to the tubes. So I do believe that in that sense, forecasting demand should be possible in linkage terms between the transport supplier, TfL and the others, and the planning authorities, the boroughs and the GLA. You still have this slightly unwieldy equation, it's just a technical equation called public transport accessibility levels, PTALs, which are extremely hard to manipulate easily. They're very unfriendly devices when I try and do them and plug and play in the development area, but they're there. Equally, that is not a Solomon machine where you turn the handle and say, here's a public transport level, that is now the permitted level of development density. If anything, people are saying in the new draft London plan, this needs to be looser. You need to allow more planning inputs, more development inputs, and potentially higher densities as well. I mean, that's potentially coming along with it. There's more to be done then by TfL in terms of pushing its boundaries in terms of how it has to work going forwards to make the denser London work and be effective.
Did you want to add anything on this?
I think just to check with TfL that if the increase in demand, that there is investment going into brilliant advertising around that demand to really make the most of it. And that's new technology that's coming in, and that needs continued investment. That's the brilliant digital screens that you see around us, but that's also the services which enable great kind of advertising experiences. So that's the Wi-Fi that's wrapped around it, that's the NFC technology that's built into the screens as you walk past it, triggers something that's relevant to you. So I think mapping against that demand should really be thought very carefully about how you've got a brilliant advertising infrastructure that's going to make the most of that, and laying those plans down correctly.
Thank you. We've already started to touch on the Elizabeth line, and clearly, massive project about to start to open in December in phases, and then fully running from next December. TfL is budgeting in the year 18-19, 151 million of fares revenue. And by 22-23, they expect almost £1 billion in revenue from this one line. Do you agree that these passenger projections are right, or do you think they're rather ambitious? Richard?
I actually was involved in modelling Crossrail about 15 years ago.
So these are your figures?
No, not mine. I was involved as a much young person. I was at LT planning for a couple of years, but TfL have LTS, they have rail plan, which have been obviously improved a lot over the years, and a lot of the demand, of course, is redistribution from existing tube, existing national rail services. That's the bulk of the demand. And I think one of the reasons for Elizabeth Line Crossrail being constructed in the first place was about congestion relief, and passengers hate crowding. So research that we did in Hong Kong suggests that in a fully loaded train with 6 persons per metre squared crush loading, people behave as if the journey time is twice as long. So if you release that congestion, either by building Crossrail, releasing that congestion on the central line, then that makes people feel as though the journey is quicker, and that in itself ought to be generating additional demand. Now, I would have thought that the distribution of demand from existing tube and national rail services ought to be reasonably, the risk of those forecasts being wrong is lower than the demand generation. And as Jonathan and Tony have alluded to, it's all about whether in particular development happens along the line. And actually, whether or not those forecasts are right, will probably not, that bit of the forecast won't be known for some time, because when we looked at new schemes, new major rail schemes worldwide, the extent to which demand ramps up to what is expected from the models is very variable. And it very much depends upon whether it's a completely new scheme in a greenfield scheme, or whether it's along existing rail corridors. And Crossrail is along existing rail corridors, but it is a densification scheme as well. So there's clearly a lot of risk associated with that 30% of additional demand that is partly driven by development. And when we looked at what transport organisations worldwide assume for that ramp up, they were too optimistic. And it suggests that particularly for new lines, the evidence suggests that you need to be considering demand ramping up over a sort of 4 or 5 year period relative to perhaps what the models would tell you in an equilibrium state. And I don't know the extent to which TfL these days have taken that sort of more conservative sort of ramp up of new generated demand. So I think that's the risky bit, is the ramp up of new generated demand, and it all ties down to population and employment changes around the stations and so on.
Some of the line is new, isn't it? Thinking coming in from the southeast, that sort of Woolwich type line is yes. New.
Yes.
But you're saying that needs to be considered over a longer period, the increase in demand from your experience internationally.
TfL may be considering a long ramp-up period, but I would suggest that over a 5 year period or whatever. But I would suggest that certainly the riskiest demand is going to be from areas where completely new transport links are being developed, and any generated demand, from brand new trips as a result of either because new trips can be generated because accessibility is improved as well. So people might choose to pop into town and pop back again, for example, in the off-peak, in a way that they probably wouldn't do without the Elizabeth line. So it's not just about development. It also induces demand in its own right by reductions in generalised cost.
Part of the calculation is assuming that some passengers, I don't know, someone coming from Reading, that they're going to choose to come off a TOC operated line and go on to Crossrail because they get a seat there and it's going to take them to Farringdon where they want to go, and it's, though there's more stops, actually that's going to be quite convenient for them. So they're going to take a certain percentage, are going to be taken from other operators basically, and TfL are going to get that income. But they also are assuming, they're going to absorb 170 million passenger journeys from other transport modes. Some of that's going to be from the tube and overground, so it's just taking from other parts of TfL network. Maybe Jonathan, what are your thoughts on whether their projections really are accurate, or is it just a bit of a hope and a prayer?
I think they're far better than a hope. Their experience, and for that matter the TOC's experience, is that there are, as it were, realistic models out there for reallocating demand. I mean, just on a quick look, the demand on the route out towards Shenfield, excluding Liverpool Street usage, which is a large proportion, obviously it's the other end of the journey, is of the order of 40 million journeys. But when you throw in the Liverpool Street factor, then it's probably considerably more than that. Let's call it 60. No, it's doing that to it. And the Great Western inners are of the order, similarly, of sort of 60, something like 30 plus million passengers a year. So already those are existing users. And then you then add a higher quality, you want higher frequency, so on and so forth. And then you join them up and you take a whole load of people out of the tubes, at least that's the aspiration. Otherwise, one of the main reasons for Crossrail has not been validated, and I'm sure it will, because the Central Line certainly should be considerably relieved. And then you layer on the new developments. You layer on the further opportunities as people start to see that actually you can make journeys that you never previously did. And you essentially build up layers of demand, would be the short headline. I don't see why the scale of 250 million passengers journeys a year is wrong. I believe that's the sort of scale which people are talking about. How that translates into revenue is interesting. You're saying that by 2022-23 they're aiming for about $1 billion worth of revenue. Well, very crude maths suggests that's about £4 a journey. In practice, if you look at the start-up numbers for next year, they're talking of £146 million budget passenger income, when the line's only just starting and essentially will just be the Paddington Abbey Wood service via Canary Wharf. With 78 million passengers. So you divide one by the other, you get about £2 a fare, which actually mirrors roughly where the Underground is. That's also roughly about £2 a fare on average globally across London. How you then translate from sort of £2 a fare within, let's call it the London urban area, it sort of feels as though it's just an express tube, so why not, to becoming an average across the entire Crossrail system of £4 a fare, that eludes me a little. Because somewhere along the way you have to have had a lot of £2 fares, but you've also got to have quite a lot of, let's say, £6 fares to make the difference. So that is intriguing, how you make the link, not necessarily in terms of volume, but how you make the link in terms of fares levels. Somewhere along the way there will have to be significant fares on Crossrail, other than the Heathrow premium pricing, where those fares will be in a sense set by, I presume, Department for Transport or TfL in conjunction with train operating companies. So that in a way is, to me, at least as interesting as making sure the layered demand happens.
And you touched on earlier about boroughs along the way playing a part in this with their planning policy. Are there other concerns you have about the Elizabeth line and whether it stacks up financially and in terms of their projections?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is, TfL has infinitely better modelling capacity than any of, or certainly than I do. So I can look at the figures they publish and then compare them with what's happened in recent years and some of the modelling we have. But I mean, one of the challenges we all have is that, as we've alluded to this morning, we know that this is a new line which will, at some level, transfer existing fare revenues off national rail system services into TfL's fare box, and trying to differentiate between that and the net extra is, they must have figures for all of this, but they may be published, but I haven't seen them, and it's very important to know what those numbers are too. So what are the figures for the net additional fare yield that comes about, which is not simply abstracting it from the national rail system? What we do have from TfL's business plan last year is the fare yield projections for Crossrail out to 2022-23, and you can net those off the rest of TfL's fare income in the same document. What that shows is that even if you net off all the extra fare revenues, whether it's abstracted from the national rail system or its new fares, they're projecting that the rest of the fares grow sharply in 2021 to 2022-3. So the non-Elizabeth line fare revenues rise by 241 million between 2021 and 21-2. So they're projecting, even if it's abstracting people from the underground and the buses within London, that the overall yield of the fares there will also go up. Of course, their model is better than anything I have. They may well be right, but it is really assuming that there's a big return to growth on the underlying system, notwithstanding what's happening on the Elizabeth line. And one final thing, we have seen some modelling based on TfL's own figures, about the, and I mentioned this earlier on, the uplift in fares in stations like Tottenham Court Road, Bond Street, Paddington and Farringdon across central London. Those are very big increases in the total number of passengers using the station. Yeah. And as I said a moment ago, I'm intrigued by the extent to which the boroughs there are matching that increase with a level of development increase that will create the jobs and the shopping opportunities where these people will be going to because otherwise I'm still not 100% sure. Were they just going to travel in and then use the existing shops and go to, I mean, as I say, and what's one final thought? Peak hour travel into central London over the long 50-60 year period is amazingly unchanged. If you go back to the 50s and 60s, the number of people coming into central London in the morning peak is not dissimilar to the numbers today. It's a bit higher now than in the recent past, but I'd expect that to step up for the first time for a long time. And again, you'd have to have development to match that. So one of the things I think TfL, if I were the mayor in TfL, I'd be interested in is how far the boroughs in inner and central London, I mean, Ealing and others in outer London, have actually jumped up and are developing much more around their stations as far as I can see. So the big challenge for me, given the justification and particularly the financial modelling that was done to justify the project, that relies on a big growth in inner and central London. And at the moment, I don't see, apart from here, where you can see it in the sky, that's the city, it's not as easy to see that elsewhere.
Interesting. Just a figure in our briefing from the last meeting we had, TfL told us that only 25 to 30% of revenue from the Elizabeth line will be new revenue.
So 600 or 700 million will be, so only 200 will be new, so 600 or 700 is abstracted, it's that way round. Okay, that's interesting.
Matt, did you have anything to add on this?
No, not hugely, other than, in the same way that Tony's asking a question about the boroughs is, again, what's the advertising infrastructure that's being built around that as well, because it's audience, make the most of that audience.
Yeah.
I would note that Crossrail 1 Elizabeth line will be serving all the satellite activity zones nominated in the London Infrastructure Plan. So it will be serving Old Oak Common to the extent that it goes ahead quickly or slowly. It does serve Canary Wharf from this December, which is already having expansion plans already under construction on the basis of the authorisation of Crossrail, and Stratford is the third satellite activity zone. So compared to pretty well any other scheme you can think of, it is going to serve the major foreseen new centres of activity, not in central London. Whether that makes a sufficient difference, it certainly should make an important difference.
I should also say that, the worldwide experience is that demand forecasts for new lines are always wrong. They're never right. The question is, how can they be less wrong?
Yes.
And, I don't doubt that TfL have done a lot of work to make sure they're less wrong. But they're very dependent upon, for the new demand, upon the development assumptions in the model, and whether those are being realised. But this is a transformative scheme. And, the North London line offered new, origin destination opportunities, and there was a tremendous growth in demand on the London Overground that was not quite expected. And to what extent does Crossrail do that for some markets as well? So there may be upside risks as well.
And now you're asking us questions, but just to check I got the 200 and whatever it was million figure right. Is it that TfL are saying that of the total revenue of 900 million by 2022-23, that only 200 million will be new, or that 200 million...
Yes, so 25 to 30% of revenue will be new revenue, i.e. passengers who are not using TfL services before.
So the other 3/4 will be existing
people
from
abstracted from other TfL modes.
I mean, that's the most interesting area to look at,
Yes.
because that for the net additional revenue, I look at my colleagues here, seems surprisingly small to me anyway, given it's a £16 billion project, but there we are.
Thank you.
Right, so we're going to look at roads now, and Assembly Member Berry is going to run that.
Okay, thank you. At our last meeting, Transport for London's Surface Transport Finance Director told us about the fact that, like buses, roads are running at a deficit. He said that the funding requirement to operate, maintain and renew our roads in London is between about 300 million to 350 million a year. So to ask Jonathan first and then Tony, if that's okay, how should they close this gap? How should London's roads be funded?
They can carry on lobbying central government, but I'm not going to rate the chances massively highly on that, at least for the current government. The corollary is to go forth and seek funding from road users. There's no other major source other than people who sort of own real estate in the vicinity of roads.
The TfL told us it would be fare payers and then businesses through business rates who would end up subsidising the roads. Is that fair?
I don't believe it's fair from a personal point of view, as you ask. I do believe that this is one case where one, in other countries, and I'll look sideways to Richard on that, would be saying, well, this is something where you put a gas tax on, for example. And you would be saying, well, let's have a small, these things always, of course, start out small. Income tax started out as small back in the Napoleonic years. You start with a small, effect gas tax, and say, you are using your car in London. There are all sorts of environmental consequences. There are some road safety consequences by definition if you're using your car in London. And it's only right that you should contribute a little more than you have been. Now, whether ultimately the central government then sort of moves slightly in terms of how it levies the petrol rates, it has VAT and it has a direct sort of petroleum taxation as well. Actually, it's a very handy source of revenue for central government as a whole, but I honestly don't see why London shouldn't be looking at some contribution that way. But you would need, presumably, legislative permissions to do so. Hence a slightly wider debate on devolution, which of course Tony's had a lot of hand in terms of London financial devolution. I think it is entirely wrong that public transport users should in a sense be having to pay not only, as it were, pay for some of their own capital investment on top of the operating costs. So we've heard from Richard that already a metro needs sort of plus 40% or whatever on top of operating costs in order to self-fund. But then should be contributing to roads which aren't necessarily going to be guaranteed to be beneficial road usage.
Okay, thank you. Tony?
Well, I fear that the position, the impasse that has been reached in the funding of, well, the non-funding of London roads, in the way that the rest of the country is to have its road funded, comes about because of the coincident decision to remove grant, to give the Mayor of London business rate instead of what used to be grant, with a view to the mayor now making decisions about that. And the government can argue, and indeed has argued, as I understand it, that the devolution of business rates to London sort of covers things like this. I think that's the origin of a sort of slightly theological argument as to whether London's being fairly or unfairly treated as compared with the rest of the country, where the road fund licence money will go to fund roads. Now, there's two things to say there. One is that, I'm not sure the yield of the road fund is a buoyant asset, a buoyant revenue stream for the rest of the country's roads, but part of that complication. The second is that I think, the difficulty with this and the origins of your wise question is that it doesn't sound right, does it? I mean, funding roads out of income that comes from public transport users just doesn't have the feel of the normal right way of doing things, given everything else we know about fares and road, and the funding of transport more generally. So I think there is a problem here. And I absolutely go along Jonathan's point about, in the end, London is always going to be faced with a question about whether it uses its congestion charging powers more extensively. And as I've said elsewhere in the past, my slight fear is that if, and I take this, and this is taking us off into a slightly different subject, but I have always slightly feared that if London government didn't use the powers it's got in relation to congestion charge, then at some point a national government would. London has the powers to do this now, and only does it for a small area in central London. And if in future a national government decided to introduce a sort of more generalised form of road pricing or congestion charging, then actually places like London would pay a lot of it because there's so much congestion in London, and then we wouldn't have the revenue. London wouldn't have the revenue. So I do think there's a sort of bigger public policy issue here, which is for any mayoral candidate in any mayoral election, whether they begin to say, well, we need to produce a longer term and more secure revenue stream for investment in the city, and that will involve a broader use of congestion charging, which could lead to more rational road use. I think there are all sorts of potential benefits. Now, I'm not in favour of higher taxes for their own sake, definitely not. This isn't a tax, of course, it's a charge. Okay. But so I do think that the system where it appears that, and indeed it is the case that, public transport fares are in some way being used to pay for roads just doesn't quite feel right.
Can I just, Tony, before we move on to discussing it a bit more widely, the powers that the mayor has extend from congestion charging to a more sophisticated type of road pricing as well. He or she could do that in the future.
I guess Richard will know more about this than me, but compared with the initial congestion charge scheme, technology has advanced enormously in 15 years. There are all sorts of different ways of doing this, which I'm not an expert in. But why do I think that every hour that passes, it would be easier to have a sort of, I'm trying not to say max fac, a sort of simple version, a simple technologically enabled version of a road pricing scheme, which could be much more variable in terms of different people at different times in different places. But I don't want to take the argument. But I just think this is an opportunity to think about that, given the context of the pressure bearing down on on TfL's finances more generally.
Yeah, we were told by TfL at the last meeting that technologically it was fine. From a powers point of view, though, it's really interesting that you're saying basically use them or lose them, that the government basically...
That's my slight fear, that because the powers do exist for the Mayor of London, and if they're not used, then national government will at some point, and then if national government decided to introduce a national system of road pricing, most of it in cities, then they get the revenue. That is the risk to all London politicians in the medium to long term.
And the other power we have in London is that to introduce a workplace parking levy. That's written into the GLA Act as well. That's something that
which exists in Nottingham. It was introduced in Nottingham, I think, without...
2012.
Yeah, and it's paid for tram improvement. I mean, again, I'm not advocating this because I just think it's, you know, I want to put taxes up. I definitely am not doing it for that reason. I'm doing it because I do think there are sort of reasons to do with pollution, congestion, and establishing a longer-term funding base for Transport for London, which are available. I realise it would be very contentious, and I understand that, you know, introducing these schemes is always prickly, always difficult. But at least I think we ought to have a debate about it again.
Just finally on to you, Tony. Sorry, this is interesting. As a further question I have, what's the most important factor in a decision about road pricing then? Is it political decision or an environmental decision to do with congestion and mode shift, or is it a financial decision? Which one of those is going to be the most important?
I think it depends who you are. I think if you want public health improvements, you'd think it was a public health issue. If you want money for TfL, you'd think it was a financial issue. If you think you want to discipline large numbers of people having stuff delivered all hours of the day and night in a random way, and freight management, you know, in a sense you can, but the other way of looking at that is, well done, in a targeted way, with good technological input, such a policy could do several things, and that's how I'd rather look at it. It could do several things at once.
Okay, thank you. So moving on to all the other guests, can we start with Jonathan? What are your thoughts on the potential sort of positive, negative issues to do with sort of further road user charging in London?
Negatives are essentially around how mayoral candidates might choose to promote that. If I'm blunt about
practical benefits from
it is. I mean, it ends up as a voting issue if you're not careful. And you know, let's be frank about that. The selling issues are what are the good things that come out of it, and I think all, frankly, politicians at the end will have to take a view on whether they judge the net effects to be beneficial to London, if they're honest, and to their own, you know, particular persuasion if they're rather, you know, as focused on that. I don't see from a technical or a sort of an officer point of view that there's anything other than a material list of goods and good things and potentially bad things, the impacts both ways, and you can have all sorts of score sheets for those. But at the end of the day, certainly so far as the issue of we're here today about TfL funding is concerned, and if you like the quality of public transport and other aspects, including roads, which TfL is responsible for, then where is it lie in the TfL liturgy of priorities for forward planning? Something along those lines has to be important, because otherwise you're hemorrhaging the order of 300 to 350 million pounds a year. And as Tony has said very, very explicitly, that is in effect being run as a tax off public transport users. I just don't think that's supportable. But how you sell that to London as a whole, to the business community, to individual residents is another question.
Richard?
Well, I'm not a congestion charge or a road expert, but no, not quite. But I was just looking from you know, from the point of view of the fact that the tube is cost, you know, it gets now more revenue than operating costs. I think the ratio is 1.2, and that's forecast to grow. That is the best performance of any metro in our 38 metros that we work with, outside of Asia, basically. So, and in Asia, generally metros are run autonomously. So there's no sort of direct. There might be a bit of indirect, but there's no direct kind of link between the revenue that they gain in excess of operating costs or costs that then goes into roads. Maybe indirectly in places like Hong Kong, but generally speaking, not directly. So it does seem a bit odd, and it would seem it's not sort of common practice anywhere as far as I know. The good thing about talking about the positives of a congestion charge of course, moving to variable congestion charging, to me, makes perfect sense. It would deliver a much more economically efficient outcome. Tackling, if it is a congestion charge, and I know it's not just a congestion charge, it's also a pollution charge as well, but tackling congestion when and where there is congestion means that you can be hitting congestion harder where it's worst, therefore improving both bus speeds and bus regularity and bus on time, bus excess wait time, which will in turn also help bus revenues. And as we all know, the buses have been hit by traffic speeds. So, it's certainly very virtuous to change to a variable system from my non-expert point of view on this, because it will have positive impacts elsewhere, and particularly where we have, light vehicles, like delivery vehicles, running around with only having to pay a single charge for the whole day, which doesn't sound very efficient at all.
From a passenger point of view, could it drive mode shift as well, and therefore sort of help fare revenue increases if you've got an additional charge for a driving journey when it's more discretionary?
I mean, there has to be some effect. If you're increasing the cost of one mode relative to the other, either it be actual price or time or comfort, then of course there will be some mode share. Mode shift. Sorry.
But I think that's all the questions.
Okay. Before we move on to the next section, we've been joined by children from Date Palm Primary School in Tower Hamlets. Hello to all of you. I'm sure you're finding it absolutely fascinating. We are, but we're much older than you. Okay, we're going to move on to the next section, which is around commercial revenue, and Assemblymember Hall is leading that for you.
Yes, thank you, gentlemen. TfL is budgeting for a large increase in commercial revenue over the next 5 years. So, firstly, if I ask Richard, please, how far can commercial revenue go towards supporting the core transport network?
So, I was looking at the sort of international comparisons again, and apologies for looking at the tube again, but this is where most of the revenues are. So, in terms of a sort of return per passenger, the tube is actually doing about as good as any system worldwide already. And I think its advertising revenues are comparable with what we're seeing worldwide as well, per passenger, which suggests that things are doing relatively well. I know there's been a dip. Globally, there's been a dip in advertising revenues for metros, which is sort of stabilising here and stabilising elsewhere around the world. But the tube is doing pretty well on that. I think the big difference worldwide, in terms of, I'm not talking about outside the metro, I'm talking about within the metro, is retail. And the big differences in non-fare commercial revenue for metros worldwide is whether or not there's good retail in stations. That's the big driver of additional revenue. However, the tube is significantly constrained to which it can leverage additional value out of that retail. It is doing so. It is repurposing shops and finding additional spaces for shops. It is, in some places like embankments, putting in shops where there used to be ticket machines or ticket offices, and all of these things are great and they have to be done, and I'm sure they are being very positive. But you do often hear in other cities in the world, I'm not saying in London, but in other cities in the world, we can freeze fares because it's okay, we can make it all up from commercial revenues. Well, on average, I think, typically a good performance, and this is what the tube achieves, is about 10% of operating costs being covered by non-fare commercial revenues. In Europe and North America, for old systems, that's about as good as we've seen. Now, okay, maybe if you're really, really good at saying you managed to, it might be about 20% in Asia, but again, that's because stations are designed for retail. But it would be quite heroic, I think, to assume that inside the metro, that revenue could be grown significantly to offset the need to long-term to freeze fares. So I would suggest that, of course, there might be a couple of % extra of operating costs to be gained out of the system based upon international experience, but it's going to be limited. However, outside of the metro, in relation to property, that's a completely different game. And of course, there are metros around the world that are self-funded, even for the original, well, there's only one metro in the world that is actually, in our group, totally self-funded from outside revenue, and that's the metro in Hong Kong, where it's able to actually use the land that it's been granted by government to develop over stations, and therefore that rent or sale of assets is then used to fund and finance the original construction of the metro. But that's a city which is just about the densest city on earth, and London is not the densest city on earth, it's far from it. It's quite low density. So the ability to sort of create those densities is through sale of property is somewhat constrained by height restrictions and so on in London. Tony probably knows more about this than I do.
Do you think TfL is particularly good or bad at doing this?
I think it's been reasonably proactive at trying to find all the opportunities that it can. I mean, the introduction.
Being proactive doesn't mean whether you're good or bad. Do you think they're good or bad in your view?
Good, in my view.
You think they're good?
Yes, I think, and the data proves it. Their non-fare commercial revenue is higher than any other comparable metro system in Europe and North America. So they must have done a reasonable job.
So budgeting for a large increase in commercial revenue over the next 5 years is sensible in your view?
Aiming for it is certainly sensible. Budgeting for it, I don't actually know what the plans are, and I don't know the extent to which that is also outside of the metro, and I don't have data on how well other metros are doing outside of the metro in terms of property development. But from inside the metro property point of view, then I believe that the TfL have done a reasonable job by demonstration of the data that we have, and them achieving quite high yields per passenger relative to other metros.
Can I help you with some of the figures then?
Yeah, sure.
TfL are forecasting they've achieved 119.
Yeah.
And they're forecasting to go up to 351 by 22-23, and 63% of that they're forecasting will come from advertising, with the remainder coming from property rent. So in the context of that, if you answer Assemblyman Paul's question again, whether you think that's about right, whether they're successful, whether it's a realistic target.
Well, it sounds quite challenging, but I don't know about the new technologies that are going to be available to advertisers, and maybe that's a game changer.
I mean, that's extraordinary growth from an advertising perspective, given that the out-of-home sector is forecasting 1.5% growth year on year. So I think that really, obviously we haven't seen the projected plan, but if it's based on current inventory, current revenue streams, with the challenges that TfL faces, both from a competitive within the out-of-home market, but then competitive, i.e. out-of-home versus mobile versus TV, cinema, that certainly needs to be questioned, I think.
Okay. Tony, have you got any particular comments?
Only expertise on advertising lies here, nothing I don't. I mean, the inside-outside the station line is a very interesting one, isn't it? Because it's come up several times. Because, I mean, inside the tube stations or the Elizabeth line or overground stations, I mean, there must be some grounds for further expansion of advertising and other income generation, though I guess in very busy stations the number of shops you can build before it becomes a problem is limited, but it's not my known world. But coming back to when you cross the line and leave the station, then you're in the hands of the borough. The borough because then what happens outside and the capacity to develop around or over the station and the risk that more than one public organisation will want the resources, by the way. I mean, once you get outside the station, I often listen to discussions about developing TfL's land, and it comes down to it needs to be used partly for, well, we want to use it both for creating more housing and to build Crossrail 2, as it were. Yeah. So the money can only be used once, and but once you're outside the station, you are very much in the hand of local planning and local public mood about planning.
So what's your view then? Do you think it's sensible to...
I agree with my colleagues. It sounds, again, an optimistic, but that doesn't mean it's wrong, view of the future.
A couple of
lots
other
of
things.
words like optimistic and brave and all sorts of words, which isn't what you want to be using, those sort of words, when you're looking at budgeting, I wouldn't have thought. But
a couple of other factors just to consider. My understanding is that the TfL has the strongest copy control regulations of any out-of-home media owner versus other media owners within the Greater London area. So that does mean it does turn down business that other out-of-home media owners take. And some of that, is understandable, but there is, in terms of TfL's competitiveness, that could possibly be relaxed to allow it to become more competitive.
I mean, if I can go on to advertising now, I know we've touched on it a fair bit, which is understandable given the conversation. Matt, what is the climate right now in London for the kind of advertising TfL does?
So, similar to when we sort of started talking about it, it's a relatively flat market. It's mature. The inventory, there's spare inventory. It's highly competitive, so you don't necessarily see an opportunity for market share to be grown by stealing from other media, and it's difficult to see market share being stolen from other out-of-home media owners. So really, I guess the growth opportunities are from the new assets that are being built, so you expand where that audience is going, but all of that is caveated with the size of the audience, because it's about scale. It's about scale. So ultimately, it's about your passenger numbers, and therefore what you can.
I mean, if you look at it, last year TfL's annual accounts show that the advertising revenue was 7.3 million under budget, and the commissioner, when he was asked about it, told the committee that that TfL didn't know why. So that's of quite a concern, I would have thought.
Yes, I think yeah, you'd always want to dig into understanding why you're under a budget. I mean, the advertising market is a challenging market. It's going through quite a dynamic change because of technology. The digitalisation of advertising essentially is changing the market as we know it. And out of home is in a very interesting position because the digital screens are being put up, and the ability with a mobile phone to interact with those digital screens, that's quite exciting from an advertiser perspective. But broadly, you don't see 5, 10%, 15%, 20% growth being projected within out-of-home for particular, for the out-of-home sector. So 63% of that growth from 119 to 350, that's over £200 million there. 60% of that, but what I'd be digging at is where else is that revenue coming in from then?
Especially given that the advertising revenue went down so much. And then you've mentioned this junk food not being able to be advertised and the opportune costs of the places that's at. I mean, I would have thought that would have brought the advertising revenue down further.
It will. The thing to consider on the HFSS restrictions is it as an advertiser, it puts me in a stronger position to negotiate with you because you're going to have more space that you want to sell. So it will allow me potentially to drive your price down.
Yes. Well, it's demand and supply.
Yeah, and if at the same time your audience is going down, then it gets even more. interesting as a conversation from a buyer perspective.
I have to agree with that. Does anybody else want to comment on that?
A brief comment. I'm not clear how much is written in by TfL about its leasehold, or most likely of overground stations and the rest. That TfL rail, Crossrail, overground stations as a whole, we're now looking with Crossrail at over 120 number of stations that could well count as additional opportunities for advertising. And that's behind the barriers. Now that isn't in scale as many as the tube, obviously, but in potential growth, it might be significant. I merely note that as an opportunity.
Is there anything drastic, Matt, being the expert on advertising, that you would urge TfL to consider?
We touched on a couple of things earlier, considering things like naming rights of stations, thinking about how to commercialise more broadly, thinking about how to advertise around the emerging ways that people are travelling as well, so pushing that forward. Another area is the brand itself, the Roundel brand. I mean, I understand it's the third most recognisable brand in the world, after Nike and Disney. And also, my understanding is at the moment that licensing team, i.e. the ability to go out and sell that brand, is a relatively small team in-house. So I think you would look at what's the licensing opportunities there. How can we sell this even more successfully internationally?
What sort of effect could stagnant advertising revenue have on TfL's finances?
Well, by stagnant you mean sort of flat kind of advertising?
Well, it's obviously dipping.
Yeah, challenge. Well, ultimately it's about the investment that comes back in, isn't it? So it's about your ability to maintain, the street furniture, the bus shelters, to update, to kit out with you sort of arrive at London Bridge Station and you're surrounded by, brilliant kind of digital screen technology, and I think that makes the whole experience of TfL a more premium experience as a customer of TfL. So if your revenue's dropping, you can't invest in that experience in quite the same way.
So therefore, budgeting for a large increase in commercial revenue could have a disastrous effect on the finances, which will impact everyone, really.
Well, the amount we're talking about in the scheme of TfL's overall budget is relatively modest, up or down. The margin, the total isn't that big, and the margin, therefore, is even smaller in terms of the overall scale of TfL's budget. And the underlying problem that they have, which we're by implication discussing all the time this morning, rightly, is, does the total amount of money that comes in from all sources match their budget for the future? Because for every pound it doesn't, something else will have to be cut. That's the rather crude issue we've got here. And there's no doubt that maximising income from advertising and analogous marketing type revenues, which TfL, the Tube, is world famous for its visuals and its way it's used advertising and so on, advertising and its own image. But I just say as a slightly separate issue that there's TfL's good at it, stations are full of advertising, which we all see as the norm. You could doubtless do more of this on the overground, but I'm guessing that unless it's done sensitively and well, you'd eventually get a bit of a pushback. That's the other thing. We all like advertising, we all think advertising can be wonderfully creative and marvellous and all of that, but in the right place. And you have to have just some sort of balance between the amount, the way it projects itself to you, and you don't want to get to a point where there's a sort of rollback anti-reaction. So I just sort of caution. Depends on how it's done, really.
Absolutely, I completely agree with that, and it isn't like there's an unlimited supply of advertisers to come into the market. You've got capacity. TfL's got capacity. And actually, some of that capacity is used for good causes for supporting London charities and and fundraising as well. So it's put to good use. But yeah, you can't assume, okay, we've got masses more inventory, we're automatically going to fill it with advertising.
And the other thing, just one final thought, is I'm looking at the new London Bridge station and other new big pieces of rail kit. I mean, you can see that the architects deep down straining to keep them pure. So there's a sort of again a balance between what architects and designers want, and their, and sometimes it can be done slightly differently because, as at Canary Wharf, the developers taken over the development of the station. So there's all sorts of ways of looking at this issue, which is to maximise the visual and financial benefit to passengers and to the TfL, but also bearing in mind that there's a sort of heritage and aesthetic issue underlying all of this as well. And I do think they have to kind of keep that in balance as well. None of us really wants to see all systems covered in unsuitable advertising, even though some advertising actually enhances your journey.
Thank you.
Slight pushback on that, because I accept and understand exactly what you've said. And this is coming from someone who wrote a report a few years ago calling for naming rights at stations. Right. And the point of it was deliberately to put a cat among the pigeons and see how TfL would react. And they reacted as though I proposed that we should sponsor the Vatican, the Pope sponsored by Nike or something like that. It was all the heritage things. We can't possibly put commercial names on the tube map, ignoring, of course, the fact that the Emirates airline is already on the tube map. And that kind of thing. It used to be said that the England rugby team had to play in pristine white and there would be no colour and no logos. Well, that's gone by the by and the world hasn't ended. The same thing with the FA Cup. That couldn't be sponsored. It now is and nobody's complained. How much scope, because you've particularly pushed this 2 or 3 times during the meeting, how much scope do you think there actually is on things like naming rights and sponsoring parts of the transport system? Do you think that there would be a significant revenue? Because I'm not blind to what Tony's just said about people being attached to the iconography of the tube map and other things. It would only be possible to do it, or only sensible to do it, surely, if there was a significant income stream from it. What do you think really would be the market?
I'd hate to put a number value against it, but my instinct is that agencies and their clients would be interested in commercial conversations around naming rights on stations. Yeah, I mean, you'd absolutely want to explore that. And you'd want to do it in a way that is sensitive, and actually you'd want to do it in a way that, we use the phrase, delighting the customer. You don't want to do it to intrude, you want to do it in a way that enhances the experience within that particular station. And, I mean, you're seeing it with football stadiums as well, Arsenal is now the home Emirates Stadium. It will continue to happen, and I do think that there are some. It would certainly be wise to be properly exploring the commercial opportunities. You don't have to commit to it at this stage, but I would be properly exploring those.
Okay. On that point, I'm going to come to Assemblymember Cooper, and then I've seen Assembly Members Berry and Pigeon in that order.
And we actually came up last night at our council meeting in Wandsworth. We have Southfield Station in Wandsworth, and someone suggested, slightly tongue-in-cheek, that for a limited period only we should rename it Southgate Fields Station. Now obviously Enfield Southgate already has that privilege. But it does, I mean, I'm following Gareth's point, I do wonder, given there are a large number of sporting events that take place across the capital, is there mileage in, on a temporary basis, delighting the customer with something that relates to, I can see lots of nods actually.
It's already been done.
I know we have occasionally, but we don't do it very often, do we?
No.
And that's the entrepreneurial part of the media ownership, which I think you would look to encourage, because advertising itself is becoming much more dynamic, much more changing with the national mood, and capitalising on those kind of cultural moments. And I would absolutely be encouraging TfL to look
renaming
that way.
Duquesne Court Harry Duquesne Court, just as a matter of information.
Amazing.
Okay, before we start talking about football and intruding on that kind of grief, let's move over. Assembly Member Berry?
Yeah, can I just ask Matt a couple more questions in terms of competing with other outdoor advertising type things. Because obviously the people on the tube are a particular demographic, the people on buses are a particular demographic. Transport for London knows an awful lot about those people, the people who get on different routes at different times, particularly on the tube, and we've discussed this in the Oversight Committee. They've been tracking people's MAC addresses off their phones and iPads and things, and anonymising this and using that to know exactly where people have come from when they're in a station and what routes those people take around stations. Is that not quite an exceptional level of targeting? I know that advertising's changing away from broadcasting to everybody who watches one TV programme to much more targeted stuff. Does that not give TfL an edge? Is that that's part of the reason they're doing that work?
I wouldn't describe it as exceptional. It's been, that tracking of, through anonymised data, really every media that is becoming digitalised is doing that same thing. So, I log into radio via an app. They will know where I am as I'm listening to that radio station and how long I've listened to that radio station. But
compared with other outdoor, I mean?
No, not necessarily. I mean, the route data, which is the industry standard for tracking, they're all tapping into the route data, and it's a combination of data as well, in terms of being able to marry that data with the advertising agencies' data, being able to marry that data with the brand's data as well. So all media owners are essentially aggregating their what you would describe as sort of first party data. They own that piece of data. So yes, it's useful, but it's a part of a puzzle that the advertiser ultimately is trying to put together the entire journey. So they fit in, but it's useful. It's useful, but I wouldn't say it's
You say they're all using route data. They're all using TfL's data that I described, or other route data like AMPR tracking of
in the same way as TV has Barb, the out-of-home industry has route, and really media planning and buying is done in the out-of-home sector is done using route data, of which TfL's inventory will be part of the route system. So if I plan and buy an out-of-home customer journey, I'll use route, which will put all of those media owners together.
Thank you. That's useful to know. And in terms of the rules on what kinds of things can advertise, you're talking about being opposed to new rules on junk food. I can't remember what you called it now.
It's HFSS.
HFSS, thank you.
High fat, sugar and salt, yeah. Because actually, I think, just to make that point, it's sort of been termed junk food, but actually, the image that junk food conjures up is very different to the image or the truth of high fat, sugar and salt products.
Cheese.
Right, really.
Yeah, exactly. So in terms of, TfL already has a number of rules. There are rules about, for example, not having adverts featuring nudity, sexual content, overtly political adverts, adverts depicting violent acts. Are any of those that you'd want to be relaxed in order for TfL to make more money, that the advertisers particularly think aren't a good idea?
No, not necessarily around. I mean, I sort of flagged the point earlier that it does have very tight copy control regulations in comparison to other out-of-home media owners. I think ultimately it's TfL's decision as the media owner in protecting its brand as Transport for London. But from conversations that I've had in terms of the preparation for this meeting, there were some opinions that it could be relaxed slightly, that there are occasions when there's pieces of advertising business that are turned down that other out-of-home media owners then take. So, but I think that's really, it's ultimately for any media owner to decide whether it fits their brand.
Do you have any idea how much extra money we could make if we just relaxed all that entirely?
It's not going to fill that gap. I mean, it's hundreds of thousands, a few million. It's not a massive amount. I think your big, the new revenue opportunities are in the entrepreneurial opportunities around TfL's assets. It's not going to come from what you would describe as kind of that traditional mainstream advertising. You've got a large chunk of it in a highly competitive market. It's not going to spike and grow.
Thank you.
Okay, Assembly Member Pigeon, and then we're going to move on to the final section.
I wanted to just really understand about advertising. The sort of adverts you're traditionally talking about are what I would call posters across the tube network. And you're saying digital is now the way forward. It's interactive. It can pop things up on your phone, whatever. Are you saying that TfL needs to invest to have more digital outlets across their estate in order to generate more advertising income?
So I think that, you know, like all of the media owners, they're going to have to continue to invest in the digitalisation of their advertising assets.
Are there any figures around if you invest in a certain digital asset, what return you can get that would be higher than what you got before when it was just posters?
Not that I could quote here, but it's something that I'm sure we could follow up with in terms of, you know, the type of investment into a digital infrastructure and what should be being planned.
Be helpful. And do you think there's going to be potential in terms of, when I say digital advertising, as in on your phone or on your iPad? TfL have got new technology being installed through all the tunnels for the new airwave contract, the new radio contract, that actually is going to allow you that you could use your mobile phone if they enable it across the whole network. Is that a way that advertising could then be used to generate more income for TfL?
Certainly. I think facilitating that smooth interaction for a consumer with media content, if TfL is investing more and more in that, I think you'd have to look at what the structure of the advertising deal is, and really know, because you're providing that service, what percentage of the advertising rates you would be getting. So I think that so for example, you know, if I'm watching my phone in the tube and I'm watching ITV and an ad is served up on ITV, how much of that money actually goes to TfL versus how much is going to ITV? So that's the bit that
becomes more complex than just the digital asset on a station.
For sure.
Okay, okay, thank you. Are we going to touch on the bullet about TfL International?
We hadn't, had we? So if you want to do that one.
No, I just was interested. Obviously, TfL's got this international brand. Is that going to be a credible revenue resource? But also, Crossrail International, I think, is sort of being developed as well. Is that, again, another potential sort of international revenue source for TfL? You know, there's talk about TfL running, they denied it last time, Buenos Aires Metro. They denied they were bidding. When I've spoken to them, it's that they haven't put a bid in yet. It doesn't mean they're not going to bid. So.
Well, I mean, there's major players out there that have significant consultancies, that have also bid for other services. Of course, the MTR is, Hong Kong MTR is here in London. Has many operations worldwide. RATP in Paris has had a similar strategy, and clearly that Deutsche Bahn, through Arriva and so on, runs trains in the United Kingdom. So, of course, it can be done, and I think it would provide a revenue stream. It's probably, I don't have the figures to hand, but it's certainly worth looking at the MTR's annual report to find out how much net revenue they've gained from their overseas business, or any, so it's or RATP Dev for that matter, which is, I think, a separate, it is a separate, completely separate business unit from RATP itself. RATP runs buses here, as you know. So, it's a reasonable strategy, and I've got no... The consultancy is something which is a bit of a two-edged sword, I personally believe, because one of the dangers is that if you have a staff which is fully employed, you want your best people to be, their best value is actually being spent here, trying to make the best of making sure that the transport network is run as efficiently as possible. That said, if you're in an era where you have a bit of slack and you feel like you have got some capacity to sell out or consult out your staff internationally for certain projects, then of course value can be generated from there. There has been some experience, I think, from other operators where they've gone into the international market and gone out again a bit. They felt that they wanted their sort of star staff, if you like, to be at home doing their day job. So I think the consultancy side of things is, but then again, you know, the Tube has just been through a massive investment programme. You know, this sort of the field of asset management, for example, is something which the UK and Australia and Hong Kong are generally leaders in internationally, and yet asset management is a new and thriving sort of area of expertise in the United States. It hasn't been matured, so there are opportunities, and also, as you say, with Crossrail as well. So I have no doubt that revenue can be generated from these sources, and many operators worldwide do. So, yeah, good luck to TfL.
Okay.
Anyone else on that, Ray?
I think I recall answering a similar question back in 2016, where I'd gone through all the previous LT annual reports on their last venture into LT International. And in the end, there was that difficult judgment of where do you prioritise use of internal staff time. And in the end, at the point when a different dialectic was around, people said, no, we better focus on our priority job, which is back here in London, and that the relative margins that were being achieved were fairly small. So the judgment was, well, let's just get on with that. But it'll come around again.
Okay, thank you.
Right. The final section, we focused a lot on increasing income over the course of this meeting so far. The flip side of the coin, of course, is reducing expenditure, and Assemblymember Desai is going to lead on that.
Thank you, Chair. So in terms of the overall picture, where does TfL now stand in comparison to, say, a domestic institution like the Metropolitan Police, or we've had a reference to Hong Kong, to other international city metros, particularly in light of some of the costs that TfL does have, payoff costs which for the last 2 years have been very high, over £50 million. Another cost that TfL does not seem to be addressing, the issue of loan interest. So in light of these particular pressures, how lean an organization is TfL? My question, this particular question is directed to you, Professor Travers, and to you, Mr. Anderson. So if I could start off with you, Professor Travers, I think in your reply to Assemblymember Hall, you talked about something else will have to be cut. They will have to maximize the income. So you've been quite specific about some of the challenges, but how lean an organization do you think TfL now is financially?
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that until quite recently, TfL had been spared much of the so-called austerity that the rest of the public sector, or much of the rest of the public sector, had faced since 2010. I mean, it's partly because it had its own buoyant tax revenue base through fares, and it was still receiving, it was involved in an expansion with Crossrail, big spending programme. I think it's fair to say until relatively recently, though this has now changed, it was less exposed to the chill wind of austerity than other parts of the public sector. That has changed, less than the Met, for sure. The Metropolitan Police has faced bigger challenge to its budgeting ever since 2010, really. So it is undoubtedly not quite the same as is it efficient. And of course, one of the oddities about TfL is that it is a very, well, it's not its fault, it's a very large public sector corporation, but not easily able to be benchmarked other than internationally via organisations like Richards. And those that are doing it, like Richards, are not doing it on a sort of value. Well, I'm sure you do have value for money indices and can infer value for money, but there isn't a sort of National Audit Office review of TfL because it's in local government and the NAO doesn't do subnational government institutions. So I think it's quite hard from the outside to give a fair and balanced judgment about whether TfL is efficient or inefficient. There was a benchmarking study done by one of the ratings agencies a few months ago, which I think looked at it, compared it, I can send you a link to this, I'm sorry I can't remember. And it compared it with the New York subway and the Paris metro and RER system. And TfL came halfway between the two in terms of, you know, broad measures of efficiency and effectiveness and, you know, value for money. So I've no reason to believe it's less efficient than other international transit utilities, and it has the enormous advantage of direct political accountability in the city. I do think is important. It's direct accountability. The Mayor chairs the TfL board. This committee and others can scrutinise it. It's city-focused. Its money is raised and its budget decided locally. So without having research to answer your question, apart from that study done by one of the ratings agencies, I suspect that TfL is not a massive outlier in terms of efficiency and effectiveness, but it's hard to give a within UK comparison with the rest of the public sector simply because no such comparisons exist. It's a rather unhelpful answer, but...
So there are some issues. If I could come to you, Mr. Anderson.
Yeah, so, I mean, overall, the tube is, in terms of the amount of sort of inputs that go in, like labour, it's kind of okay on a labour, on an efficiency point of view, but the big sort of problem for the tube is the cost of that labour. And I know I'm treading on slightly dangerous ground here, but it is, though, a metro in one of the most costly cities in the world. But we do make adjustments sort of purchasing power parity and things like that. And even on a purchasing power parity basis, the unit cost of labour is high. But, of course, as you know, the cost efficiency of the underground since 2005 actually has improved by 27%. Or the unit cost of producing capacity has reduced by 27% since 2005. Now, probably 2/3 of that comes from the investment programme. So, you know, you're delivering more output for the same input. It's great to run more trains, but the whole system becomes more efficient. You've got fixed assets, you want to use them as much as possible. Of course, the other thing that was worth it, a few years ago, before the current push, administration HQ costs were a little bit higher, or you know, the proportion of operating costs that were HQ costs was quite high, and so that's been brought down, I think, to more or less sort of comparable levels. That was, of course, the easy. Well, it wasn't easy for anybody that lost their job, but it was the sort of easy win, if you like, to trim HQ costs and reduce the workforce there. We've seen a lot of effort by TfL to, you know, renegotiate contracts and materials and so on, which have delivered cost efficiencies. Ultimately, at some point, the difficult things start to happen, or the difficult choices have to be made. Now, some of it might be technologically driven, as with the stations programme, for example, moving people out of station ticket offices and into more customer-facing roles, which is more quality orientated. So that's a good thing. That's more sort of quality efficient. And of course, technology will allow more multi-skilling and remote things going on, you know, with investment, you know, remote observations of lifts and escalators and things like that. So, you know, technology will play a part in continuing to deliver efficiencies. But of course, I think that if you say is it the labour efficiency problem that's, is it labour efficiency or is it cost efficiency of that labour? Of course, it is probably the biggest nut to crack is the cost of labour. And but you can improve on that by increasing output, by having the same amount of staff but delivering more tube services or bus services or so on. So, and on the roads, of course, again it comes down to, on buses, again it comes down to things like speeds. So again, if you invest in if you restrict road traffic, if you invest in bus priority in particular, then that has a tremendous effect upon the efficiency of the bus services, because you're delivering customers quicker with, you know, more regular buses and with better dependency of journey time with this, you know, with the same amount of assets. So you know, so international, compared to its European peers, you know, the Tube is you know, reasonably okay. And I think, you know, you see in New York, for example, we've got very significant issues with double manning of trains and so on, which of course we don't have here any longer. Then double operation of trains.
Thank you for that. A couple more questions. So if I could ask you again, Professor Travers, and then coming to you, Mr. Roberts. So TfL embarking on a huge savings program. We've been told about things that are going to be doing around contract management and so on. This is all in the future over the next 5 years. But so how can you explain an organization that just finds an extra £200 million of in-year savings like they did last year?
Sorry, can they do it? Are you saying, is it possible to do that again, or will they end up making on mid-year savings? I mean, mid-year savings are never great, are they? Because it's sort of unplanned. Because if you're sort of, you know, the thing to say is TfL still has a very, I mean, by the standards of any other, you know, it's a local authority, and compared with any other local authority, compared with some government departments, it's a huge budget. That's still the case. I think, and I've said this to the chair in the past, that following the way resources move through its books isn't, and indeed board papers, is not always as easy as it might be. It's another issue for another day. So, you know, mid-year adjustments never sound a great idea in any public authority. Longer-term plans to reduce or to make the system more efficient, to deliver more for less, are, of course, you know, who could disagree? It's very hard, though, again, to judge how far the big issue is, would it affect operational effectiveness? That is, you can cut back, reduce spending per head of staff member, or whatever it is, improve productivity. But the question is, will the public still get the same or a better service? And I think we are, if I'm honest, I think we're a long way away from having adequate tools, adequate ways of measuring that. You know, the Office for National Statistics as a whole finds it very hard to measure public sector productivity. And, you know, we're in no different a position here in London. So I'm slightly giving you a rambling answer here, I'm afraid to say. You know, it's hard to judge whether they can do what they say they're going to do, but we must assume it's in good faith.
What I'd written in anticipation was achieve higher net yield. Because achieve higher net yield. Now, however, whether that's financial, whether it's quality of service, if benefits for London, I rather think that it's very hard to turn a juggernaut. You sort of tickle it and it moves very slowly like that. Now, there's been quite a large jump by this administrative organisation in the last few years, particularly with the current mayor's stimulus as well. How much more can be achieved when you run the risk of efficiency actually being head count but not actually delivering then better on the ground is my fear, that you end up you run the risk of taking away from front of house when you need that to be absolutely there, quality on time. And how much left is there of back of house when actually you're wanting it to be better on forecasting, better on this, doing the other. So I have my doubts in the short term. But there are things in hand, and I was just going to try and very quickly go through it sort of on a modal basis and see whether there are more opportunities. So far as the Tube's concerned, I mean, someone's already mentioned the station ticket office programme, sort of the new staffing arrangements. That was put in hand in 2015, thereabouts. It's taken several years to come through, but it's there. It has happened in immediate terms, but there's again a limit to the amount that you can do that before you, with stations that are underground, actually manage into safety areas of concern rather than equality for the passenger. The service volumes, 4 lines modernisation, the old subsurface upgrading has been delayed but is in hand, and that should come through with results that are better service frequencies across the subsurface lines in the next 2-3 years. New Tube for London is seen as the way forward for the tubes themselves to get up to higher frequencies and better operating costs and higher capacities on the lines which are less easy to address than the Victoria line and the Jubilee line. But again, those are longer term still. And indeed, they've been put back in timescale because of funding problems. So how does one leverage that forward to achieve better on the tubes? And the tubes themselves are sort of a slightly London phenomenon. They're not an ordinary metro. They're actually all sorts of cost issues and access issues which have to be addressed. Crossrail itself is, I see, going to be running at quite a large deficit in 2018-19. The sooner that can be accelerated into make at least sort of cover its operating costs, the better actually for TfL, and hence its criticality going forwards. But in 2018-19, it's there as making a very substantial, sort of needs a very substantial contribution from the central coffers to keep going, to get going. Buses, the key area there is obviously we've mentioned that the current subsidy levels which are necessary. Are there ways of making bus organisation, bus planning more efficient in terms of the routing, scheduling, the size of buses? I'll merely say that because that is a process that potentially needs to be reviewed and addressed again. Each route appears to be done as a group for sort of up on a cyclical basis, 5-7 years, something like that. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you plan every route along a specific corridor at the same time. Now, and that may be a degree of inefficiency. Could you plan around interchanges as an alternative set of options? Another option which actually came forward with in the paper I did for the Transport Committee, I think, last year. So that there are opportunities there. And I would also look to the overground, because the overground is highly dependent on cost inputs from National Rail and from Network Rail. And it sort of washes its face, but I wouldn't put it any stronger than that. I think if I had a hand in it, I would be asking, well, could I, as TfL, have a stronger role, maybe a stronger control on the cost inputs that come in from the National Rail side, from the Network Rail side going forwards? That potentially is a net revenue impact issue that could be positive. So I'll raise that as well. There we go.
My final question, Chair, is to Mr. Roberts. So if I could ask you again. So less income has implications for capital expenditure, and we've already seen TfL suspending plans to buy new trains that would increase capacity on the Northern and Jubilee lines. They've cut their funding to boroughs, but yet they have ambitious investment plans. There's talk of £3.3 billion being spent per year for the next 20 years. Levels of investment beyond any anticipated income. So in light of everything we heard this morning, the budget deficit and so on, do you think we might see more investment cancelled? Can you foresee any problems?
The difficulty is to balance your books going forwards in the absence of any central grants, which are effectively going out the door or have already gone out the door. There's potentially a limit to the extent to which you can reapply the sort of the business levy being returned back to London. And as we've seen already, there's another 350 million going out on the roads, which I think is one of those urgent areas to address. That even dealing with that would only deal with 10% of the total spend, which TfL is needing to do a year. It's presumably fairly heavily borrowed on the prudential borrowing front already. I'll look to Tony on that one. And indeed, the last time I looked the other month about the sort of reliability and stability indicators that people like Standard & Poor's do in terms of their merits in loaning money but TfL borrowing as a local authority. Two of them were saying, yes, it's all right if push came to shove, then the central government would cover. But the other one was saying, we're not quite so sure going forwards. They still said central government would do it, but with more hesitation. It would be it would be my instinct. So the ability to borrow further and deeper partly will depend on the ability of fares levels and receipts levels. At the end of the day, there's going to be a direct equation between the borrowing, the earnings capabilities inwards and the scale of borrowing that can be done. That's not a complete answer. I do actually still wonder how you fully fund 3.3 billion a year. I mean, that is a very, very large challenge going forwards. You can try and, as they've done recently, effectively mortgage off one rolling stock in order to help buy the start of the new Tube for London process. I'm not sufficient of an expert to know how much more of that type of process can be done. Tubes are rather specialised trains. You can't just say, oh, well, there's another marketplace for them elsewhere, apart from perhaps a few trains on the Isle of Wight.
Thank you. Okay, well, final question then. We're almost at the end. If each of you, obviously independently rather than together, were the Finance Director of Transport for London, what would you do differently? I think I'll probably start with Tony and then work out.
Differently?
Or would you do nothing differently? Would you carry on?
No, well, well, as I've said to you before, Chair, I mean, I would present the... I would improve the presentation of financial data in order that it made it easier for this committee and others to scrutinise it.
You're preaching to the choir.
And steps have been made, in fairness to TfL. I do think the more outside TfL, the way its finances work, the easier it is to help them, in many ways, generate the case for investment and public service improvements, which more or less nobody's against. So I think in that sense, I would ask for improved clarity in the way the organisation presents its financial information, making it easier for those outside to be certain what's going on.
Matt?
I would say at the moment, I think it's the scrutiny around some of the figures that I've heard today, and also a real close look at some of the things which are happening, you know, as we speak around the potential restrictions, which are coming in and will impact on the figures as they're being projected. So broadly, TfL's in a great position as a media owner. You know, it has fabulous assets that media owners would love to get their hands on. So, you know, as a financial director, I would also be saying, are we making enough money out of these? What else can we do?
Richard?
I don't know what the finance director does normally, so I don't sort of sure.
We've been puzzling
I can't say whether or not
fair on him, actually.
he's doing this or not, but I think it's very important to be able to communicate the long-term impact or the long-term cost effect of any cutbacks on investment or maintenance. And I think with the asset management plans, I think TfL are probably quite adept at doing that. And the other thing is to make, I think it's not just the FD, but the whole of the organisation really, is to ensure that, you know, that when new assets are introduced, what are the opportunities in terms of, you know, new operating practices, in terms of inspections and so on, that could drive greater efficiency. But I know it's quite contentious. And also, I mean, from a self-interested point of view, I'd always say that TfL should be looking internationally, as it is, to see where, in particular in assets, where because that's where the biggest money, that's the biggest expenditure that can actually be changed, I believe, is actually on making sure that asset expenditure and reinvestment and renewal is as efficient as it can be, based on international practice.
Finally, Jonathan?
I would worry about how to raise higher borrowing capacity. That may be linked to fares levels. Certainly it ought to be linked to the ability to do more with the commercial estate side of things. I would certainly see what could be done in respect of making Crossrail start running its side on a balancing the books basis as fast as possible, because that's good for London and it's good for TfL. The roads, we've come back to several times, that is a cost outwards that potentially needs to be addressed as a very high priority, because that's funds not coming in one way or other, or funds going out in the wrong way. And I come back to bus operations as an area where I think it is a massive network, needs some more TLC and some more priorities.
Hey. We've reached the end of our questions. Can I thank our guests very much for their attendance and for the answers they've given. Members, can we note the report in today's discussion?
Noted.
Can we also agree to delegate authority to me as the chairman of the committee in consultation with party group lead members and Caroline Pidgeon in the usual way to agree the final report for this investigation? Agreed. Thank you. Item 6 is the Budget and Performance Committee work programme. Can we agree the work programme, including the schedule of prospective topics at paragraph 4.5 of the report? Agreed. Date of the next meeting is the 27th of September at 10 o'clock in this room. There is no any other urgent business, so the meeting is closed. Thanks very much, Tony.
GLA Chamber